Welcome to Myanmar Musings, the research podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre based at the Australian National University, Canberra. Hi, I'm Luke Corbin. It's February 10, 2016, and this is the very first Myanmar Musings podcast, a momentous occasion indeed. This podcast was inspired by others, such as the Up Close Research Talk Show at Melbourne University, the Dissonance of Things podcast, Anthropod, and the Sinica podcast based in Beijing. We aim to deliver concise, informative, informal conversations with leading researchers, journalists and thinkers working in or on Myanmar. Today our guest is Dr. Jane Ferguson, anthropologist, lecturer and faculty member in the School of Culture, History and Language at the College of Asia and the Pacific here at the Australian National University. Jane's Myanmar research interests are eclectic, from ethnic politics to popular culture and passenger aviation. She has published in a number of scholarly books and journals, including contemporary Buddhism and cultural anthropology. Jane recently completed significant research on the phenomenon of the census in Myanmar, the 12th of which was completed in 2014, 3 decades since the last, although some claim an accurate census hasn't been taken since 1931. Hi, Jane.
Hello. Mingalawa, Maisungka.
So, I'm curious, what first got you interested in censuses generally and this particular census?
Well, this particular census, first of all, it was in the news leading up to it. I know that there was a lot of international funding from the UN, for example, in organizing it and creating the categories for the census. And because of my background in studying the Shan and the Shan insurgency and ethnic politics and ethnic relations in the country, I was very curious to see how they would treat the issue of ethnic categories. And so that first came as a puzzle to me.
Okay, great. So at its most basic, why was this and all censuses important? And do we have all the data? I think some of it hasn't been released yet.
Yes, that they have not been completely released yet. A census is important for state administration, first of all, to know what the resources are of that state, how many people there are, first of all, how many taxpayers they have, how many soldiers they can recruit. This is the reason that censuses exist and have for thousands of years when you think about it as part of bureaucratic administration. And especially in the context of Myanmar, potentially looking at international investment and international aid, international organizations want to have an accurate representation of the resources and both human and material resources, and they want to have accurate statistics before they consider what kind of aid they're going to give, which towns they're going to help, what kind of education basis they have, essentially how to distribute resources effectively.
The data that has been released, has that been generally non-controversial, or has it been controversial? And what hasn't been released yet?
Well, they still have not released the data, as far as I've noticed, regarding the various ethnic categories. But for example, I mean, people were surprised that the population numbers were lower than expected. They expected that the population would be more than 60 million. Census is about 54 million, if I remember correctly. There's other issues like the census that was done in the early 1980s had suggested that the Muslim population was around 4%. People say that that was startlingly low. And on the other hand, if the census figures come back for the 2014 census saying that the Muslim population is much higher, it could fuel the fire for people's argument that there had been more so-called illegal migrants coming in. So whenever the population of a marginalized group is unexpectedly low or unexpectedly high, that still has political consequences.
You touched on a couple of things there, which is the usefulness of the census for state administration. You've also argued that the census in Myanmar is rooted in imperialism. Can you speak to that?
Well, first of all, the first censuses in Myanmar were actually under the Burmese kingdom, King Talun, in the 16th century, or actually, no, the 15th century, following contact with Portuguese. They had begun to administer state censuses. The Tangangsian is an exercise to find out what are the military capabilities of the kingdom. So first of all, And as is true with ancient Rome and ancient Greece, that censuses were taken out to find out where they could recruit potential soldiers from. And so doing a census is part of a military strategy, also to assess the potential tax base for a kingdom, to know your kingdom. Once your kingdom becomes so large that you cannot just monitor it by having it, within your site or your domain, you have to rely on empiricism, which are facts and figures, statistics, which, showing facts through numbers and knowing what's out there, as it were. So there's that, and also the fact that the Myanmar kingdoms had long made use of sophisticated law books. They kept statistics, they kept data on their kingdom. And so there had long been censuses carried out by Myanmar kings, decennial ones. So every 10 years they would carry out their censuses. It was long before the British arrived that there had been censuses in the kingdom. They were more concerned with human resources than land resources. I mean, Southeast Asia traditionally has been an area that is not very densely populated. So the wealth of a kingdom is measured by the people that it can muster, not by how its land is measured. But when the British came, they started to impose different categories in the census. They wanted to take their census, but for the purpose of maintaining their empire. And when Burma was annexed to British India, they started to use the same categories that they were using in India to measure Burma.
Okay, well, one can see a few potential pitfalls there. You also touched on migration, which there was something very interesting in your research, I thought. At the points where the British were just starting to do their censuses in Myanmar, Rangoon in particular, Yangon, was the number one port of entry for migrants. Only adding further.
In the beginning of the 20th century, one could say that Yangon was the most cosmopolitan city in the world. It had more international arrivals annually than New York.
So how did the British attempt to work with that, based with these categories from India and their own kind of preconceived ideas? Did they treat these newly arrived migrants as citizens or as aliens? Or
okay, well, citizenship laws is often related to census operations, but the census can take place regardless of citizenship. I mean, they are related, but they are independent exercises, as it were. But I was particularly interested in the 19th century, the ways in which colonial anthropologists tried to make use of caste categories that they had extracted from a certain area in India, and how they tried to apply those caste categories to British Burma, and then also how they tried to use ideas about caste to make a broader argument about theories of race back in Europe. Anthropologists collecting data about human diversity for the purpose of making a theoretical argument, but then also because these caste categories became part of the census, they become a bureaucratic reality, and then they become a state reality for how the state understands people.
As I understand it, the 2014 census was controversial in large part due to the specific fields regarding race and ethnicity, and people were provided with, I think, 8 kind of major groups and then 135 subgroups.
Mm-hmm. The list of 135 Dangintha is what they're called in Burmese. It literally translates into children of the state, but it's often translated into English as official races. That within these 135, if you are a member of one of those groups, you are a full citizen of the country. You have to belong to one of those 135. The list itself, how it was composed, how it was contrived, is a mystery. I have a colleague of mine, Nick Cheeseman, has been doing work on the Dangintha categories and how they've been used in their applications for law and citizenship practices. The 135, and often part of the controversy is that Rohingya does not appear on that list. Therefore, they are not considered a genuine ethnic group from Myanmar. There's other groups that don't appear on it either. For example, Eurasian. So if somebody has a British mother and a Myanmar father, they still would not be eligible for citizenship under this under this category. So there's a lot of groups. Gurkhas, for example, it doesn't matter how many generations you've lived in the country. If you don't have evidence that you're one of those 135, you will not be a full citizen of Myanmar. But this particular list only started to appear in the 1980s. There were over 140 groups in the 70s. There are 8 official races, and those are according to the names of the ethnic states and then the Burman-dominated regions. So you can just look at a map of the country and say, okay, there's Kachin, there's Shan, there's Kaya, there's Kayin. The official races, the 8, that comes from discourse at independence, that there would be the Burman majority, and then there would be the ethnic nationalities, which would be the other groups that would have their designated states. Any citizen of Myanmar will have their ID card, which lists their official race, and then they're one of the 135 national ethnic groups. So the categories have been part of the nation's bureaucracy since the 1980s.
This sounds really complex, especially in the way that the census data is actually taken on the ground. How did it sort of play out? Did you unearth anything or talk to anybody about how the actual census enumerators, what they did when they were confronted with someone who wanted to be and was adamant that they were, for example, a Rohingya?
That was massively controversial. And first of all, they, with the UNFPA support for the census operation, and they invested quite a lot of money in training sessions about the census and in encouraging people to participate in the census. There's also the issue that in a place like Myanmar, having dealt with decades and decades of military rule, people would not necessarily want to participate in a state-sponsored data collecting operation, because then they feared, oh, okay, if they know what resources I've got, then they might take them. People would be, because of those decades of military rule, people are already suspicious of state projects. So they did try to round up and encourage people to participate and emphasize how this could be good for the future of the country and good for the future of the population. Things like allocating resources for local hospitals, local schools. You need to have census demographics if you're going to make those kinds of decisions, and having up-to-date and accurate statistics is instrumental, quite literally, for those kinds of allocations. So what they did was they trained 80,000 enumerators to go around to visit people's homes and gather census data for each home, estimating that it would take about between something like 20 to 45 minutes to enumerate each home, and that it would be the census enumerator filling in the data sheet, which is like you call them Scantron type sheet, where you have to bubble in with a number 2 pencil so that it can be read by the machine. But it would be the census enumerators who would do this. And the census enumerators tended to be local school teachers. And by choosing local school teachers, well, first of all, it makes sense because they're government employees. They're familiar with bureaucracy. If you want to trust anybody in a village that to accurately fill out a form, you would probably want to choose a school teacher to do that. They're university graduates, which is a plus, but on the other hand, they also tend to be Burman. And back to the census categories for ethnicity, for example, within Kachin, for example, there were 12 different subcategories within Kachin. And some members of the Jingpo subgroup within those 12 were saying, no, these other groups are merely clan names. They're not actually separate ethnicity. And for them, if you have a minimum of 100,000 people in your group, you get a representative in a chamber of nationalities. So political representation is predicated on having a minimum number of people in your group. Then they saw the greater number of categories as reducing their potential political power.
And that's where you can think of so many myriad kind of analogies across the country of that situation.
Right. And even though, in many ways, especially to the outsider, that Myanmar is absolutely dizzying, that there'd be so many groups, so many different categories, a lot of the same issues come up, that when you have somebody that's the member of a marginalized group and then they see their group subdivided according to more categories, there's going to be a problem for people who have investment in their minority group having representation.
So on this inherent politicization, I suppose, or the politics that are involved in these groups, were there any particular campaigns being run by any groups around the census? And then what kind of complicating factors were involved in the respondents there? For instance, some people might not want to self-report as something if they self-reported as something else previously.
Yeah, well, that has been an issue, and that's been reported by even British colonial enumerators back in the 19th century in terms of caste categories. As soon as there is a political incentive to be a member of a certain group, then your data might change. People might realize, well, it's better for me to be a member of Group A because they have more benefits than Group B. Why not just say that? And in colonial Burma, for example, it was in 1901 that the census enumerators decided that they were going to abandon categories of caste and then use language as the surest determinant of race/tribe. They were still interested in finding out race and tribe people based on, these were anthropological theories of the time then. Forget the fact that many people didn't have an endonym, their own name for their tribe or their group, or they didn't have their own name for the language they spoke. It's like, okay, what language do you speak? I speak speech, for example. They weren't getting the answers that they wanted, so they would often ask neighboring groups, oh, what language do those people speak? And you can imagine how imprecise this was.
Very messy.
So part of the problem of doing social statistics is that you're often trying to reduce a very complex social reality into something that is a simple number that you can compute. How you do that reductive process is always going to have serious political implications depending on how those numbers are used.
So do you think it's fair to say that because of this, the contentiousness of particularly the race ethnicity part of the census, that is the reason why these are the last things to be, the last data to be released? The government aware of that? And
yes, I think so. They realized what a contentious issue it was. And in the 2014 enumeration process, there was the issue of whether people would put down Rohingya and would be willing to put that for a census taker and say, like, look, this is Rohingya, this is how it's spelled. I remember seeing in some of the IDP camps that they were even passing out little pieces of paper to people in the IDP camps so that they would know how to self-report. They did have the option to self-report, but then there were news stories coming out that census enumerators were saying, what should I do if these people false report? There was actually a fine and a potential prison sentence for people who were falsely reporting. And if the state does not acknowledge Rohingya as a legitimate category, and a census enumerator doesn't acknowledge that Rohingya is a legitimate category, can a person honestly be self-reporting that they are Rohingya? And finally, in some of the places, some of the areas that they were enumerating in the Rakhine state, people were reporting that they were Rohingya, and enumerators were not filling that in on the census form. They were expecting people to report that they were Bengali, so that at least they would be counted in the census.
I've got good friends who have been enumerators in the census here in Australia, and they work in their local area. Although they find it awkward sometimes going into strangers' homes at the end of the process, they feel like they've gotten to know everybody. It's been, a good thing to do, and it's been a cohesive process. But it sounds like this, in some areas of the country, potentially could have been extremely stressful for all parties.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the way in which the state uses the census to know its population, and when there are political problems and social problems, how does the state seek to know them and understand them? Is it trying to know these problems in order to give aid and help communities, or is it trying to know these problems in order to further marginalize those groups?
That is interesting. So you've self-identified as an anthropologist. Do you think what are the differences in approach, or what's the value that an anthropologist can bring to, for instance, studying something like a census as opposed to, say, a political scientist?
not to diminish the important work that political scientists have been doing about the census, but thinking about categories such as ethnicity or gender or religion. These are categories that anthropologists often question because they are not biologically immutable categories. Anthropologists, through doing cross-cultural research, look at the different ways in which human beings associate themselves with ethnic groups. They see ethnicity as fluid. The same thing with gender categories. Gender categories differ across cultures as well, and we know that religion is something that people can acquire and it's something that people can change. It's not something that is a fixed category. But when states design census questionnaires that take for granted that some of these are fixed categories, then the anthropologist will first say, well, hold on a minute. Culture is learned. We learned this in Anthropology 101, that people acquire culture through their lives. So these categories are not automatic. And then the extent to which these categories are an accurate reflection of the population. So that's probably one of the most fundamental ways that anthropological insight can make us think about things like the census and state operations in ways that might be different. The point is that it's not just about who is doing the counting, who has the power to impose categories on people, but also who counts, who is eligible for those categories. So it's a relationship between characteristics not just of the state, but also the people who are eligible for those categories. Who gets to decide who is eligible for a certain ethnic group? What are the criteria for belonging? Is it because somebody says that they're Mon, they're really Mon? Do they have to speak the language? Do they have to be acknowledged as Mon? Do their parents have to have citizenship cards that says they're Mon? There's a whole range of criteria which are actually quite flexible in a lot of ways, and these boundaries are never fixed for what constitutes a group and what's the boundaries between one group and the next.
Okay, great. Well, I think we'll finish there. Thank you so much, Jane. Really appreciate it, and I hope to see you again on Myanmar Musings.
Oh, thank you for your interest in my research.